The golden letters on the facade of a luxury hotel promise absolute perfection. But the grandest empires of the hospitality world are not built on exceptional service. They are built on the cold, calculated art of buying silence. In the spring of 1950, the world stopped to witness the spectacular Elizabeth Taylor-Nicky Hilton wedding. It was a heavily publicized union of Hollywood royalty and hotel aristocracy that seemed written in the stars. Yet, behind the scenes, this glittering event marked the darkest chapter in the Hilton family history, exposing a legacy of violence and corporate cover-ups. The public saw a fairy tale romance, but 18-year-old Elizabeth Taylor soon discovered that her new spouse, Conrad Hilton Jr., also known to the world as Nicky Hilton, was a man consumed by violent demons. Just 8 months after walking down the aisle with Elizabeth Taylor's first husband, the teenage starlet fled their honeymoon in absolute terror. Her body was bruised. Her spirit was broken. The family empire mobilized immediately. They deployed millions of dollars to systematically erase her desperate confessions from the mainstream press. They had to protect their pristine brand. But the most dangerous threat to this multi-billion-dollar dynasty did not come from an iconic Hollywood actress with a team of high-powered publicists. It came from a quiet, working-class woman who wore a simple uniform and cleaned the luxury suites where the family secrets were swept under the rug. Deep within the corporate archives of the hotel conglomerate, buried beneath decades of tax filings and property deeds, lies a weathered leather ledger dating back to 1955. Inside, a single handwritten entry details a mysterious transaction of $75,000. It was classified dryly as routine maintenance services. In today's economy, that sum translates to nearly $1 million. This suspicious payment was not used to purchase fine French linens or Italian marble. It was a financial weapon designed to erase a devastating crime and alter the destiny of an entire empire. We will uncover the shocking truth behind this secret ledger and the woman who threatened to bring down the dynasty. But to understand how a $75,000 check could buy absolute immunity, we must first look at the ruthless patriarch who built this empire from the dust. This is the dark history of the Hilton family. The story of this unforgiving empire begins not in a gilded ballroom, but in the bleak, oil-drenched flatlands of Cisco, Texas. The year was 1919. Conrad Hilton Sr. was an ambitious man who possessed a terrifying mathematical mind and an absolute absence of sentimentality. He did not care about hospitality. He cared about optimization. When he purchased his very first property, a dilapidated, drafty establishment called the Mobley Hotel, he did not see a sanctuary for weary travelers. He saw a machine that could print money if he squeezed every single square inch of space. The Mobley was a chaotic haven for desperate oil field workers who slept in 8-hour shifts. Conrad Sr. immediately realized that empty space was a financial sin. He ruthlessly dismantled the hotel lobby. He ordered the removal of the comfortable writing desks, the decorative plants, and the plush armchairs where guests used to converse. In their place, he installed extra rental beds and tiny, cramped retail counters selling cheap cigars and newspapers. He sold every corner. He commercialized the very air his guests breathed. To Conrad Sr., hospitality was not an art. It was a brutal exercise in cost-cutting and spatial efficiency. He established a corporate culture where human comfort was secondary to the bottom line. It was a philosophy that would define his commercial conquest of the American landscape. It was in this suffocating atmosphere of relentless greed and emotional starvation that his eldest son was raised. Conrad Nicky Hilton Jr. was born into a world of immense, cold privilege. From the moment he drew his first breath, he was a captive of his father's suffocating expectations. The patriarch did not want a son. He wanted a perfect, polished clone to inherit his sprawling commercial kingdom. He groomed the young boy to be the undisputed king of the hotel industry, demanding absolute perfection and showing zero tolerance for weakness. But Nicky did not inherit his father's sharp financial instincts or his relentless work ethic. He inherited only his immense vanity, his explosive temper, and a deep, hollow void that no amount of family money could ever hope to fill. As the pressure to perform escalated, the young heir sought a desperate escape from his father's shadow, turning to the dark comforts of high-stakes gambling and heavy drinking. The empire was expanding too rapidly to notice the rot developing at its core, but the cracks in the heir's psyche were about to widen into a chasm that would swallow everyone around him. And the first person to fall into that darkness was a young girl who thought she was marrying a prince. Conrad Hilton Sr. did not just buy hotels. He engineered a financial machine. By the mid-20th century, the Hilton name was synonymous with modern American expansion. The strategy was simple but predatory. He targeted legendary properties with rich histories and poor management. In 1943, he bought the legendary Plaza Hotel in New York. He paid $7,400,000. To the public, it was an acquisition of luxury. To Hilton, it was a math problem. He cut costs immediately. He carved up grand rooms to create more rentable space. He fired excess staff. Conrad Sr. believed that space was money. In his hotels, there was no room for waste. If a lobby had a decorative pillar, he built a custom showcase around it to rent to jewelers. If a hallway was too wide, he narrowed it to squeeze in another linen closet. He measured success in pennies per square foot. This obsessive mechanical view of human existence was the air his children breathed. Then came the ultimate prize, the Waldorf Astoria. In 1949, Hilton acquired the management contract for the most famous hotel in the world. It was a hostile, calculated move. But buying these massive properties required immense liquidity. This is where Hilton pioneered a ruthless financial trick: the sale-leaseback. He did not want to tie up his capital in heavy brick and mortar. Instead, he sold the physical hotel buildings to insurance companies and wealthy investment syndicates. He walked away with millions of dollars in cash. Then, he leased the buildings back to operate them under the Hilton brand. He owned nothing. He controlled everything. The sale-leaseback was a financial magic trick that bypassed traditional banking. By selling the physical asset and leasing it back, Hilton avoided the massive interest rates of the era. The insurance companies got a steady, low-risk yield. Hilton got immediate, tax-free cash to fund his aggressive global expansion. It was a perfect loop. The cash from the sale of one hotel was used as a down payment to seize the next. It was a corporate pyramid built on paper and prestige. It was a masterclass in leverage. Cash flowed into the corporation without the burden of property taxes or real estate depreciation. The company reinvested this cash to buy more competitors. Net profits soared by 30% year after year. The brand became an unstoppable juggernaut. Wall Street cheered. But while the corporate balance sheet was flawless, the family balance sheet was rotting from within. Nicky grew up in a world where love was tied to performance. He was constantly compared to his father's empire. He was expected to be a titan. But Nicky was hollow. The pressure of the Hilton name did not forge a diamond. It crushed him into dust. Conrad Sr. needed a successor. He chose his eldest son, Conrad Nicholson Nicky Hilton Jr. To the public, Nicky was the brilliant heir apparent. The company gave him the title of vice president. It looked perfect on paper. In reality, the title was an expensive illusion. Nicky Hilton did not understand balance sheets. He did not care about sale leasebacks. He cared about adrenaline. His real office was the high-limit blackjack tables of Las Vegas. His working hours were spent in dark bars, fueled by imported scotch and pharmaceutical stimulants. He was a liability with a famous last name. In a single weekend, Nicky could lose $50,000 at the tables. In 1950, that was enough money to buy several suburban homes. The casino bosses did not worry. They knew who to call. The Hilton family office operated a secret ledger. It was a quiet fund designed specifically to clean up Nicky's disasters. Every bounced check, every unpaid gambling debt, every wrecked luxury car was paid off in silence. The family lawyers made sure no police reports were filed. They made sure no tabloid reporters received tips. But Conrad Sr. was running out of patience. He was a deeply religious, intensely disciplined patriarch. He viewed his son's degeneracy as a personal insult. More importantly, he viewed it as a risk to the brand's credit rating. A loose cannon could sink the ship. The patriarch decided his son needed to be managed, not by a therapist, not by a rehab clinic. He needed to be managed by a public relations campaign. The boy needed a wife, but not just any woman. He needed a shield. A beautiful, world-famous distraction that would turn the media's attention away from the midnight brawls and the gambling debts. Conrad Sr. began searching for the ultimate asset to secure the family legacy. He was about to broker the most expensive merger of his life, and the acquisition was a human being. The early 1950s marked the absolute zenith of the Hilton dynasty. Conrad Hilton Sr. was no longer just a hotelier. He was the undisputed king of global hospitality. His name was chiseled into the limestone facades of the most prestigious properties on earth. The Waldorf Astoria in New York, the Palmer House in Chicago, the Townhouse in Los Angeles. These were not mere buildings. They were sovereign territories of wealth. From the outside, the Hilton name represented the gold standard of the American dream. It was a world of crystal chandeliers, white glove service, and pristine marble lobbies. But behind the scenes, the empire was fueled by a ruthless, mechanical drive for profit. And at the center of this gilded cage sat the crown prince, Conrad Nicky Hilton Jr. Nicky was the physical manifestation of unearned privilege. He lived a life of staggering, unchecked excess. He was handsome, charismatic, and completely hollow. While his father spent 18 hours a day calculating the profit margins of bed sheets and soap bars, Nicky spent his days spending the fortune he did not build. His father had gifted him the title of Vice President of the Hilton Hotels Corporation. It was a corporate fiction, a title designed to appease shareholders and give the illusion of a stable succession plan. In reality, Nicky had no office. He had no responsibilities. His only real job was to exist as a beautiful, wealthy representative of the family brand. He did this job in the casinos of Las Vegas and the exclusive clubs of Los Angeles. Nicky was a fixture of the high-stakes baccarat tables. He would routinely lose $50,000 in a single night. In the early 1950s, $50,000 could purchase a block of suburban homes. To Nicky, it was pocket change. The family offices in Chicago quietly processed the losses. They categorized them as promotional expenses. They masked the bleeding. Nicky lived in a sprawling estate in Bel Air. He drove custom-built sports cars. He flew on private chartered flights. He wore bespoke suits from Savile Row. He was surrounded by sycophants who praised his charisma and ignored his growing instability. But the gilded life was beginning to rot from within. Nicky was not just a playboy. He was a severe alcoholic. His drinking was not a social habit. It was a desperate, violent escape. As the booze flowed, the charming air disappeared. In his place emerged a volatile, angry young man who deeply resented his father's shadow. Conrad Sr. watched his son's descent with cold detachment. He did not offer rehabilitation. He did not offer fatherly guidance. He offered a business solution. To the patriarch, Nicky's public drunkenness and massive gambling debts were a direct threat to the stock price. The Hilton brand was planning a massive public expansion. They needed to project stability. They needed to project wholesome American values. Conrad Sr. decided his son needed a wife. But not just any woman. He needed a human shield. A woman so famous, so beautiful, and so beloved that her presence would completely blind the public to Nicky's dark side. The search did not take long. The perfect target was already under the studio lights of Hollywood. Her name was Elizabeth Taylor. She was only 18 years old. She was a silver screen goddess in the making. She was the absolute jewel of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. Elizabeth was breathtakingly beautiful, incredibly naive, and desperately looking for an escape from her controlling mother and the intense pressure of the studio system. She saw Nicky Hilton as a real-life Prince Charming, a handsome, wealthy man who could sweep her away from the artificial world of film sets. The marriage was not a romance, it was a merger. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer saw the union as the ultimate promotional campaign for their upcoming film, Father of the Bride. Conrad Hilton Sr. saw it as a multi-million-dollar free advertising campaign for his hotel chain. The studio agreed to pay for the wedding dress. It was a masterpiece of silk and pearls that cost $100,000. The ceremony was planned down to the millisecond. It was designed to be the social event of the decade. 3,000 guests were invited. The press coverage was unprecedented. Nicky played his part perfectly during the rehearsals. He smiled for the cameras. He stood tall in his tuxedo. He looked like the perfect husband for America's sweetheart. The public was captivated by the fairy tale. They saw two young, beautiful people at the absolute peak of human existence. They saw a union of Hollywood royalty and corporate royalty. But the illusion was incredibly fragile. Behind the smiles and the champagne toasts, Nicky was already drinking heavily. The pressure of the upcoming spectacle was triggering his worst impulses. The family lawyers and public relations teams worked around the clock to keep the bottles hidden and the outbursts quiet. They managed to keep the facade intact until the vows were exchanged. The wedding of the century went off without a hitch. The couple departed for their 3-month honeymoon in Europe aboard the Queen Mary. The cameras captured their final, smiling waves as the ship pulled away from the dock. The world envied them. They believed they were watching the beginning of a beautiful, lifelong dynasty. But the moment the shoreline vanished from view, the cameras stopped flashing. The heavy oak door of the luxury suite clicked shut, and the gilded dream instantly transformed into a living nightmare. Impunity is a highly addictive drug. When you escape a public scandal with your inheritance intact, you do not learn humility. You learn that rules are merely suggestions for the poor. For Nicky Hilton, the quick divorce from the world's most beautiful actress was not a warning. It was a green light. The Hilton family lawyers had proven they could silence a Hollywood icon. Silencing a working-class woman would be child's play. By the mid-1950s, the cracks in the Hilton dynasty were no longer just private embarrassments. They were structural threats to a multi-million-dollar corporate empire. Conrad Hilton Sr. was preparing to take his company public on a massive scale. He was negotiating international expansions from Madrid to Tokyo. He was building a global brand that represented clean, capitalist American sophistication. A drunken, violent heir was a liability the balance sheets could not tolerate. Nicky was officially the vice president, but his daily routine consisted of waking up at noon, drinking gin before lunch, and losing thousands of dollars at the baccarat tables. He was a depreciating asset. The board of directors watched him with absolute terror. They knew it was only a matter of time before his violence escaped the penthouse and landed on the front page of the New York Times. That moment arrived on a quiet afternoon in 1955. The setting was one of the flagship hotels of the Hilton portfolio, a place where the wealthy came to be pampered under crystal chandeliers. Virginia Larson was a young woman who worked in the housekeeping department. She was paid pennies to scrub the marble bathrooms and change the silk sheets of the elite. She was invisible. To men like Nicky Hilton, the service staff were not human beings. They were part of the infrastructure. According to later investigations by renowned biographer J. Randy Taraborrelli, Nicky cornered the young maid inside a vacant luxury suite. The details of what happened next were whispered in the hotel corridors for decades. It was a brutal, physical assault, a display of unchecked privilege and drunken rage that left the room in ruins. Virginia Larson did not have a studio backing her. She did not have a publicist to spin the narrative. She was a working-class woman in an era when accusing a billionaire's son of a crime was considered social suicide. But she refused to be quiet. She threatened to go to the local police. She wanted justice. She wanted Nicky Hilton in a jail cell. This was the nightmare scenario Conrad Hilton Sr. had feared. A public trial would not just ruin Nicky, it would destroy the carefully crafted image of the Hilton brand as a safe, wholesome haven for families and business travelers. The corporate response was swift, cold, and devastatingly efficient. The Hilton legal department did not act like a defense team. They acted like a private intelligence agency. Over 100 corporate lawyers and fixers were mobilized within hours. They did not seek the truth. They sought absolute containment. They began by analyzing every detail of Virginia Larson's life, looking for leverage. They pressured her family. They threatened her friends. They made it clear that a legal battle against a dynasty with infinite resources would leave her ruined, jobless, and blacklisted from the hospitality industry forever. But Conrad Sr. knew that threats alone could fail. Desperate people do desperate things. To truly bury a secret of this magnitude, you need to build a golden bridge for your enemy to retreat. This was the moment the corporate machinery created a template for modern elite cover-ups. They did not use a standard company check that would leave a paper trail for the auditors. Instead, they designed a complex financial transaction that would bypass normal accounting systems. They needed a mechanism that would transfer a small fortune without raising the suspicion of IRS investigators or minority shareholders. And they found it in the dark corners of the company ledger. They prepared a document that would change the nature of corporate warfare forever. A document that proved that in the world of high finance, even the most heinous acts have a specific dollar value. But this transaction was only the beginning of Nicky's ultimate betrayal of his own father's legacy. The family was about to turn on their own blood in a way that would leave Nicky completely hollow. Let us return to the leather notebook. The year was 1955. The entry in the ledger was simple. It recorded a payment of $75,000. To the untrained eye, it was a routine operational cost, a line item for property maintenance. But hotels do not spend $75,000 to repair a single room. In 1955, that sum was an absolute fortune. It was enough to purchase a block of suburban homes. It was the price of absolute silence. The mechanics of the transaction were brilliant in their simplicity. The money did not come directly from the Hilton corporate account. That would leave an obvious paper trail for the auditors. Instead, the legal department routed the funds through a shell company registered in Delaware. The shell company paid a consulting firm. The consulting firm established a private trust. The sole beneficiary of that trust was Virginia Larson. This was the birth of the modern corporate cover-up. The internal accountants classified the payment as a tax-deductible business expense. They called it capital improvement. The government indirectly subsidized the cover-up of an assault. At the same time, the local police department received a sudden, anonymous donation for their pension fund. The police report filed on the night of the assault simply ceased to exist. It was not filed in a drawer. It was burned. The witnesses among the hotel staff were handled with equal precision. The assistant manager who heard the screams was promoted. He was transferred to a flagship property in Chicago. The elevator operator was given a paid vacation and a new assignment in Miami. The staff learned a valuable lesson. Silence was rewarded. Dissent was professional ruin. Virginia Larson signed the papers. She received her trust fund. She packed her bags. She vanished from the history of the Hilton dynasty. The $75,000 worked perfectly. The brand was saved. But the cover-up had a fatal side effect. It convinced Nicky Hilton that he was untouchable. When you can erase a crime with a single signature, you lose all fear of consequences. Nicky believed his father would always catch him. He was wrong. Conrad Hilton Sr. was a businessman, not a savior. He looked at his eldest son and saw a depreciating asset. The scandal with Elizabeth Taylor had cost millions in damage control. The incident with Virginia Larson had threatened the very survival of the brand. Conrad Sr. decided to cut his losses. He did not disown his son publicly. That would cause another media storm. Instead, he neutralized him. Nicky was stripped of his operational authority. His title of vice president became an empty shell. He was banned from the executive suites. His signature was no longer valid on corporate checks. He was given a generous allowance and a simple instruction: stay out of the way. The golden boy was locked in a golden cage of his own making. Without the pressure of the family business, Nicky had nothing left but his addictions. His daily routine became a slow-motion destruction. He woke up with vodka. He spent his afternoons taking barbiturates. He spent his nights at the baccarat tables in Las Vegas. He was a living ghost. The hotel staff at the Beverly Hilton watched him stumble through the lobby. They saw the heir to the throne lose his mind in real time. But the orders remained the same. Do not look. Do not speak. Do not interfere. The end was inevitable. On February 5th, 1969, the engine finally stopped. Nicky Hilton was found dead in his apartment. He was only 42 years old. The medical examiner listed the cause of death as a sudden myocardial infarction. It was a clean, clinical term. It hid the decades of alcohol abuse, drug addiction, and physical self-destruction. The family had the quiet funeral they always wanted. No reporters, no cameras. Conrad Sr. stood by the grave. Witnesses noted he did not shed a single tear. He had already buried his son years ago when he stripped him of his name. The liability was finally gone. The Hilton brand was safe. But the patriarch was not finished. Conrad Sr. had one final transaction to make, a final move that would shock the entire family and leave his surviving children with absolutely nothing. The final chapter of this gilded tragedy did not begin in a courtroom. It began in a quiet bedroom in West Los Angeles on March 5, 1969. Conrad Nicky Hilton Jr. was found dead. He was only 42 years old. The official medical report listed the cause of death as a sudden heart attack. But those within the inner circle knew the unvarnished truth. It was the inevitable end of a decades-long descent, a slow, agonizing suicide by installment. The human body can only withstand so much. Nicky had spent 20 years attempting to drown his father's expectations in oceans of scotch and handfuls of sedative pills. The golden boy had rusted from the inside out. His funeral was a somber, transactional affair. Conrad Hilton Sr. stood beside the grave of his firstborn son. He did not shed a single tear. To the patriarch, Nicky was not a tragedy. He was a bad investment. He was a liability that had finally been liquidated. The father turned his back on the cemetery and went straight back to his office. The empire could not wait for grief. 10 years later, on January 3, 1979, the patriarch himself died at the age of 91. The surviving members of the Hilton family gathered for the reading of the will. They expected to finally inherit the massive fortune they had spent their lives protecting. They believed their loyalty and their silence would finally be rewarded with billions. Instead, they were met with cold, calculated betrayal. Conrad Hilton Sr. had left almost his entire estate to charity. 97% of his shares in the Hilton Hotels Corporation were willed directly to the Conrad N. Hilton Foundation and the Roman Catholic Church. The family was left with virtually nothing. The patriarch had decided that his bloodline was unworthy of his legacy. He believed that giving his children billions would only destroy them, just as it had destroyed Nicky. The family was furious. They had spent decades covering up assaults, paying off victims, and burying police reports to protect the value of those very shares. Now, they were being cast out of their own castle. Nicky's younger brother, Baron Hilton, launched a brutal, decade-long legal war to break the will. He challenged the foundation. He exploited loopholes in the 1969 Tax Reform Act, which prohibited private foundations from owning more than a certain percentage of a business. Baron argued that the foundation was legally obligated to sell the shares and that he had a prior option to buy them at a fraction of their market value. The legal battle was vicious. It dragged the family name through the mud once again. But in 1989, a settlement was reached. Baron Hilton successfully clawed back 4 million shares, securing control of the hospitality giant. The family had won back their gold. But the moral ledger remained deeply in the red. Today, the Hilton brand is a global behemoth valued at over $20 billion. Its glittering towers stand in every major city on Earth. Millions of travelers check in every single day, completely unaware of the ghosts that haunt the corridors. The $75,000 payoff to Virginia Larson in 1955 was not just a single transaction. It was the blueprint for corporate survival. It was the moment the Hilton family realized that any human tragedy, any act of violence, could be converted into a simple line item on a balance sheet. Elizabeth Taylor went on to become an icon of survival, leaving the trauma of her first marriage behind. But Virginia Larson, the maid who stood up to a monster, was successfully erased from history. Her name exists only in a forgotten leather ledger and a few buried legal documents. Her silence was bought, paid for, and filed away under maintenance expenses. This is the cold reality of old money. Great dynasties do not survive through brilliant management or superior service. They survive through the calculated suppression of the truth. They build their empires on marble, but the mortar that holds those stones together is the silence of the vulnerable. We look at the sparkling facades of the ultra-rich and we see success. We see achievement. But if you look closely at the foundation of any great fortune, you will find the cracks. You will find the stories that were never meant to be told. Subscribe to the channel to uncover the dark financial secrets of the world's most powerful dynasties. Remember, behind every great fortune, there is a hidden ledger.